All right, folks. Thank you so much for coming to this colloquium sponsored by the Philosophy Club and also the Philosophy Department. Today, Chris Phillips, who is an instructor in philosophy, is going to be talking to us about Descartes' super secret hidden defense of the piety of Heliocentrism. I'm really excited to hear Chris's talk. Hope you are too. After he's done chatting, there will be time for question and answer, and I'll be keeping a queue to help organize things. So until then, take it away, Chris.
Well, thank you all for coming. I have a feeling that some of you are here purely for the extra credit, but that's fine. I'm going to pretend that you're here for me. So as Professor Cogley suggested, I'm going to be talking to you today about the super secret hidden defense of the piety of Heliocentrism. Now, of course, a little bit of background is in order. So Descartes originally started his intellectual career working pretty much primarily in physics and cosmology. So he was trying to figure out basically what the nature of the universe was, and he was tutored by some famous physicists at the time. But right around 1633, the church famously condemned Galileo for saying impious things, saying things that didn't jive with the church doctrine. At that time, however, Descartes was writing a book called Le Monde. Le Monde is French, of course, for the world. And in Le Monde, it was a piece of physics where he was trying to demonstrate that following just from the nature of physical objects, that not only is the Earth in motion, but the sun is in the center of the universe. And although his physics didn't look a whole lot like Galileo's or Copernicus's, there's obviously still the same sort of upshot, right? The Earth is in fact in motion. Now, he got a little bit spooked when he saw what happened to Galileo, in part because, at least he says, in part because Galileo was fairly close friends with some of the cardinals, and Descartes himself didn't have such a close relationship with anybody who was in power, and so he got a little bit scared and decided to not publish Le Monde. In fact, he wrote that he nearly burned the work because he was so afraid of what would happen to him. After all, Galileo, being friends with the cardinals, got house arrest until he died. What would happen to Descartes, some guy who nobody really cares about? Well, okay. So it was never published during his lifetime. It was published posthumously. But he wrote a couple of months later to Mersenne, leader of the church, that he decided to suppress the treatise instead in deference to the church. So this is sort of his MO. He's going to always give the church what they want, more or less. But that's not to say that he gives up on his attempt to discuss physics. In fact, what I want to suggest is that instead he turned to metaphysics, which of course we all know since we're in philosophy classes or we've taken philosophy or at least heard of it, is roughly something that underpins the issues in physics. And so he wrote again to Mersenne, this time a little bit before the publication of the Meditations, that he was looking to provide a textbook for his system of physics, and he wanted to sort of show the ways in which you could derive the nature of motion, the nature of physical bodies, from certain truths that we can get by doing metaphysics appropriately. And so this little book on metaphysics, which I'm suggesting Descartes wrote in order to ground all of his physics, is the Meditations, right? And as we can see from the end of this extraordinarily long quote, basically the book that he sent to Mersenne that he was looking to get published, the Meditations, contains all of the principles of Cartesian physics. So I don't think that I'm out of line when I suggest that the reason that he wrote the Meditations was to try and get people on board with his physics, with his system, with that kind of thing. Now, a couple of interesting things I think going on here. Of course, he mentions the Sorbonne. He's looking to get sort of He's looking to get it picked up as a textbook, this sort of thing. Now, most people think, at least most philosophers think, that the Meditations, in virtue of having been written in the first person, Descartes writes, or the meditator at least, speaks about his or her own experiences. Most people think that that's supposed to be an autobiographical account of how it is that Descartes came to all of these conclusions. What I want to suggest, based on some recent work done by a couple of philosophers, is that that's not at all what's going on. And I can give you some arguments for why exactly it is that Descartes isn't writing in his own voice in the Meditations during the Q&A if you're really all that interested in it. But for now, just take my word for it and know that I can probably back it up. Okay. As further evidence that that what he's doing is he's trying to get clear about how to do science correctly in the Meditations. Look at this. I think this is the third line of the first meditation. He says, I was convinced that I must once for all seriously undertake to rid myself of the opinions that I had formerly accepted and commence to build anew from the foundation, if I wanted anything at all in the sciences, stable and likely to last. Right? So it seems like he's telling you right up front, I want to do science well. And if I want to do science well, it seems like we need to start from a pretty solid foundation. Now, notice that I say there's a wrinkle there, and then there's a bunch of what appears to be gibberish. It's not gibberish, it's actually Latin. And I mention this because, again, the whole purpose of this talk is to show that even though the sort of first meditation is celebrated for being a great piece of epistemology, there's something a whole lot more going on. But this word right here, scientia, is the infinitive form, is often translated as science. That's the way it's translated in all of the editions of the Meditations that you'll ever read. But, strictly speaking, the way that Descartes used that term in the Latin generally refers to any broad system of knowledge. So any knowledge whatsoever that's sort of far-reaching. So even though we talk about it as if it's science, we translate it as science, and we read it as science, that's not obviously what Descartes meant. Now, I do think it is what he meant, but, again, I would need some sort of argument for that. I'm going to try and provide that with the rest of this talk. But knowing that Descartes meant by that something like a broad system of knowledge, most philosophers see that as a sign that he had given up on doing science and was more interested in doing what we traditionally now call philosophy. So I'm going to tell you what we've got coming up next. First, I'm going to discuss the structure of the first meditation, which for anyone who is in any of my classes, you have probably heard 30 times now. But it's okay, because we'll go over it again. After that, I want to turn and I want to talk about Galilean impiety. So Galileo got himself in trouble with the church, as I mentioned, for saying impious things, doing impious things. And I want to mention in passing just what I think is sort of going on there, because I want to set up for Descartes' hidden defense, as I suggest. In order to do that, I'm going to appeal to an oversimplified version of Aristotelian physics, and I'm going to give you a basic idea of what that is. I'm going to contrast that then with an oversimplified version of Cartesian physics, Descartes' physics. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to show what Descartes probably thought the worry was at the time. Right? The reason that he was so scared of publishing all of his works. And I'm going to try and suggest that in virtue of this description that I'm giving, we can make sense of how exactly it is that the first meditation is actually a defense of Cartesian physics. It's a defense of the piety of the motion of the earth and this sort of thing, which I'll do, again, as a return to the structure, because I think the structure of the first meditation is actually the defense. After that, I'm going to return to a common objection that I get at the end of this paper when I presented it before. 4 or 5 people have presented this objection. I think I have an answer. So I'm going to try and head that one off. And then, of course, you can tell me why my objection doesn't, or why my solution doesn't actually work. So that's where we're going to be going. Are we all okay with that?
Your show?
Outstanding, thank you. All right, so what is the structure of the first meditation? Well, as I said, philosophers tend to think that basically what's going on in the first meditation is a piece of epistemology. And it's an important piece in the history of epistemology because it is a series of increasingly complicated skeptical scenarios resulting in the disastrous proposition that literally anything that we believe is unjustified. There is not a single belief that we currently possess that we should maintain. And then, of course, famously, everybody thinks that Descartes can't get himself out of this problem. And it's a total disaster, and it's the biggest blunder in history, but man, he was really good at coming up with skeptical scenarios. All right. So, it starts off in the Meditator. I'm going to refer to it again as the Meditator. Notices how many beliefs that she had when she was young that turned out to be false. And we've, of course, all had that happen to us before. We've, of course, realized that perhaps our parents lied to us about things like the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. And then there were, of course, other things that are perhaps more interestingly false. But it's in virtue of these sorts of things that the meditator wonders, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to engage in any sort of project of knowing anything at all, it seems like I need to be able to sort out those beliefs that are true and those that are false. So how exactly am I supposed to do that? I have way too many beliefs to examine each one individually by its, sort of on its own, hold it up for scrutiny. That would take way more than an entire lifetime, and it's absolutely not worth it, right? So there must be a way to sort of expedite this process of getting rid of the crappy beliefs and making sure that we have the good ones, and only the good ones. And so in order to try and do that, the meditator decides, all right, I came up with this method. It's the famous method of doubt. Again, you all, of course, know what this is. The method of doubt just states that if the source of our beliefs has deceived us even once, has provided us with false information even one time, then we have reason to doubt everything based on that source. Now, this relies on a particular metaphor that's very famous and very important in the history of epistemology, that we can attack the foundation of our beliefs, right? Just like if you undermine the foundation of a building, the whole thing is going to come crashing down. If you undermine the foundation of your beliefs, then all of the beliefs that are based on that come crashing down around it. And in fact, Descartes' meditator thinks this is obviously the appropriate method for getting rid of all of the crappy beliefs. In fact, we can get rid of all the beliefs, it turns out. And so we have this, I say in the seventh replies, there's this analogy to a barrel of apples. Descartes says, in an attempt to make sense of the method of doubt, look, it's not an attempt to be a skeptical scenario. All it's supposed to do is to expedite the process of eliminating all of your beliefs, so that we can start over from a fresh foundation of infallibly true beliefs. Descartes says in the seventh replies that if you had a barrel full of apples and you knew that some of them were rotten but most of them were not, the best way to figure out which ones were bad and which ones were good isn't to pick up each one individually and check it out and see if it's good and then put it back and try again. You just dump the whole thing and start over and put back the good ones and leave out the bad ones. Problem solved. This is what he's trying to do with the method of doubt. He's trying to just help us get rid of our beliefs so that we can start over with just the good ones. And so the first source of ideas that he goes after, the first source of our beliefs, is just this sort of general naive empiricism. The idea that the senses provide us with the best information about the world. And he goes after that just by pointing out that there are all kinds of different ways in which our senses deceive us when we don't get very good information. If it's dark outside, if you're far away from something, if it's cloudy or raining, if it's foggy, if I'm not wearing my glasses, I can't see anything. Some of you can relate to that, I'm sure. Right? These don't just make me look cool. They also help me see cool things. Now, of course, we all know that, and that's not terribly exciting. So when sensory conditions are non-optimal, we probably shouldn't rely on our senses. Okay, great. Thanks, Descartes. That doesn't help us get rid of all that many beliefs, right? I mean, generally, we don't hold beliefs based on poor perceptual experiences. So what Descartes does is he takes, or the meditator does, is takes this giant leap forward and says, all right, wait a minute. I'm going to try and get rid of a whole lot more. And Descartes introduces, or the meditator introduces, famously, the dream argument. Now, the dream argument, again, is probably familiar to all of you. Many of you, in fact, are writing a paper about it right now. But the dream argument says something like this. It is, in principle, impossible to tell the difference between being awake and being asleep and dreaming. That's not to say that it's always impossible to tell the difference. But the experiences that you have when you're dreaming are at least qualitatively identical to those that you have when you're awake. And so if even once, remember, according to the method of doubt, you've been deceived and you've thought that a dream was real, either while you're in it or the next morning or something like that, then you have reason to doubt all of the beliefs that you have that are based on the senses. So we've gone from getting rid of virtually no beliefs to almost all of them, right? That's a huge jump forward in terms of the strength of these skeptical scenarios. Now, immediately following the dream argument is a passage about which scholars have spent a lot of time arguing. It's the painter analogy, all right? And so what's going on here, what I'm about to tell you, is not uncontroversial. What's going on here is that Descartes seems to be suggesting that there are some things that we still can't quite doubt. Okay. The analogy is supposed to be something like this. Even when we're dreaming, the things that we dream about are not entirely novel. It's impossible to come up with something completely brand new. That's not just a recombination of experiences we've had before. That's not maybe an exaggeration of features of bodies or something like that we haven't seen. Just as with paintings. In a painting, of course, they can create crazy things, sirens and hippogriffs, he suggests. But those are just recombined features of objects that we see all the time. It is not as if the painter, or the dreamer in this case, can take things and create something entirely new. Well, so why does that matter? Well, it implies at least, as I suggest concept empiricism here, it implies at least that still open to the meditator is the fact that our ideas are originally coming in from the senses, even if we can't tell the difference between dreaming and waking experiences. They have to have come from something outside of us. And they have to have come from something outside of us through the senses. That's at least open as a possibility. So, even with that in place, however, there are a number of other beliefs that it seems can't really be doubted still, right? And Descartes' meditator says this explicitly in the meditation right after this. She says, look, there are all kinds of other truths. We have truths of logic. Seems like we can't doubt those. We have no reason to doubt those, even if our senses aren't totally reliable. Modus ponens is always going to be valid or something. Arithmetic, simple arithmetic is still fine. Even if you're dreaming 2 + 2 is 4. That's kind of how that works, right? Geometric truths. Triangles still have 3 sides, even if you're dreaming. Right? These are just, they're necessary truths. It seems like they can't possibly be doubted. All right. Other conceptual truths survive, so to speak, this argument. Things like bachelors being unmarried males or something like that. Right? We've got that. So these things are still surviving. So we still have some beliefs. It seems like that's a pretty good foundation. We've got geometry, we've got arithmetic, we've got logic, we have conceptual truths. These are all pretty good. They seem pretty stable. But of course, lots of things seemed pretty stable before we started this meditation, before we started engaging in this crazy process that Descartes wants us to. And so Descartes doesn't stop there. He has the meditator continue and say, well, okay, look, we all know that there is this perfectly good God who guarantees that all of our beliefs are accurate, that they're not confused, everything is fine. We all know that, right? Again, deference to the church, right, who's kind of afraid. We all know, of course, that that's there. But wait a minute. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, shouldn't I not always have a bunch of false beliefs? And if that's the case, and it certainly seems like it's the case, then at least according to the method of doubt, we can reintroduce this problem, right? Maybe God isn't perfectly good after all. Because we have, after all, been deceived at least once before. We've had false beliefs. We've had what seemed to be very reasonable beliefs that turned out to be false, some more reasonable than others. Right? Santa Claus is maybe not all that reasonable. But the Easter Bunny, I mean, come on, that makes a lot of sense. So we have this problem now. Wait a second. Only in virtue of the method of doubt can we start to worry a little bit. Maybe God is not sort of all on the up and up. Maybe God is out there trying to deceive us a little bit, or at least letting it happen. And if God is letting us be deceived, then maybe God isn't perfectly good. And now that God is in question, the divine guarantee is now in question, Descartes can advance the most difficult, the most challenging, the most insane, quite honestly, skeptical scenario of all. Can we rule out for certain that there is not some being that is as powerful as God is supposed to be, but that is not entirely evil? How would we rule that out? I don't know. And as only a philosopher would do, Descartes imagines that what an evil being would do is not cause infinite suffering or something like that. It's not that the evil demon would do something like that, but instead would create your mind in such a way that you can't help but believe that 2 + 2 = 4 when it doesn't. Because the evil demon of a philosopher is one who makes you believe false things. Classic. Right? And so this is now the worry. Well, wait a minute, maybe there is such a thing. Maybe there is such a thing. And so now all of a sudden, maybe triangles have 19 sides, and I shouldn't trust this belief that seems so obvious to me. Because wouldn't it be cool for this evil demon? Wouldn't that be just like the best way to get to us? To start us off with a series of false beliefs that we can't help but believe are true, and then say, yeah, you go ahead and try and figure out the world. You go try and do physics, and then just sit in the corner and laugh at you. Right? I mean, this is terrible. This is bad news. And so we're left in this position of total skepticism. We can't know anything. Everything is off limits. We're all totally in trouble. Now, of course, the structure of this meditation, all of the epistemological issues, all of the worries about what we can know and can't know, it just suggests itself. And so it's not surprising that philosophers, when they read this, think this is obviously a work about how it is that we know stuff. And it does, none of that sounds like it's about physics, right? I mean, at no point are you thinking here like, yeah, okay, obviously, we're trying to figure out how to build bridges and stuff, how to fly to the moon. No, this is all weird, crazy philosophy stuff. Great. I'm going to argue it's not. So, Galileo. Galileo was famously condemned in 1633 for holding a view that was false philosophically and formally heretical because it is expressly contrary to the Holy Scripture. Okay. I've looked around a little bit, and I've asked people, what does that mean? What exactly was it that was in violation of the Church's teachings, of the Holy Scripture? I've paged through the Bible once or twice, and I never really saw anything that struck me as all that problematic. Some people said that it's because you can't read the Bible literally if Galileo was right. And then they point to passages like Joshua 10:13, where Joshua stops the sun in the sky. And the sun has to be in motion then, right? The sun is circling the earth. But that always struck me as something that was not satisfactory as an explanation. Wait, because one passage in the Bible was inconsistent, Galileo needs to be condemned to house arrest forever? That seems crazy. Okay. But I wonder, what exactly does literal mean? Only a philosopher could ask that question too, right? What exactly do we mean literally, right? The Bible can't be read literally. This is what brings me to Aristotle and Aristotle's physics. Because I think that when you read something literally, you read it against the backdrop of whatever you take to be the best description of how things work. And the best description of how things worked for about 1800 years was Aristotelian physics. Aristotelian cosmology dominated from the time of Aristotle until about the time of Copernicus, 1500. And even then, of course, there were slight advances. We have the Ptolemaic system instead of the Aristotelian one, so we have even crazier views happening in cosmology. But they still maintained a couple of key features, one of which was that the Earth was not in motion, it was sitting still in the middle, and everything was revolving around it. Also, we have these crystalline spheres surrounding everything. And the planets and things are located, they're fixed to these crystal spheres. That explains the perfect circular motion of everything because those are in motion, right? They're moving around, they're spinning around the Earth. And that also explains their orbit and this kind of stuff. But there's more to it than that. There's our buddy Aristotle. According to Aristotelian physics, or at least according to my massively oversimplified version of Aristotelian physics, everything that exists is a compound between form and matter. He calls it a homomorphic compound. All right? There are a couple of different kinds of forms. There are essential forms, forms that determine what the thing is, forms that make a thing what it is. And there are accidental forms, forms that give things features that can change, right? Kind of basic stuff. Now, of course, a particular object that is a substance has any number of different forms going on at any moment, and they can kind of come and go and free float and bounce back and forth between objects. The accidental ones can anyway. But the substantial form, the form that makes it what it is, when combined with the kind of stuff it's made up out of, the elements, determine, quite literally for Aristotle, the behavior of that body. Right? Aristotle thought that physical bodies fall, or heavy bodies fall faster than lighter ones. Perhaps comically for us, right? Because they're made up of more earth and they want to go back to where they belong. Right? It's all of the motion is derived from the inside of the body. Like it's trying to get back to its natural place. That's why fire goes up, because fire wants to go back up to the sun where it belongs. Sounds crazy now. But it was pretty good for back then. But in any case, this is important. Because everything that exists was a combination of some sort of form and matter. There was no form without matter, and no matter without form. You gotta have both, all right? So the substantial form and the material determine largely the motion of the body. It's all interior, it's all inside. The gods, the planets, get to move in perfect motion because they're perfect. They're outside of us. They're outside of the terrestrial sphere because they're made of better stuff, right? So they belong outside doing better things than what we do. We're just confused and lame. And so their motions need to reflect their greater degree of perfection, right? So they move in this perfect circular motion because circles are perfect. This is a holdover, I think, from the Pythagoreans and Plato. Right? Circular motion. The circle is the perfect form. Right? But they're fixed. They're attached to these crystalline spheres, and those things rotate. Aristotle posited that there were 55 of them in total, which allowed him to predict, with surprising accuracy, the apparent motion of the planets. It was really a pretty impressive system. Whether or not there, of course, existed all of these spheres, we now think there don't, right? Because we've shot things to other planets and we haven't run into them. Haven't shattered the universe by accident. But that's part of the story, right? This is what dominated for so long. Ptolemy maintained that there were still these spheres, and Ptolemy came quite a bit later. And that was a system that dominated for a long time. So there are these spheres out there. Okay? The important takeaway, though, is that for Aristotle, the behavior of bodies on Earth is radically different from the behavior of bodies outside of Earth, in the celestial realm. It's very different. And the behavior of bodies on Earth are different from one another. depending on what they're made of, and depending on what they are. All right? So let's turn to the Cartesian physics. The Cartesian physics that had Descartes so worried right up front. For Descartes, everything that's physical is exactly the same. It's all the same stuff. It's essentially the same. There are no forms that change how things behave. It's just physical stuff. In fact, the only feature that's really relevant to physical stuff is that it takes up space. It's extended. That is what it is to be a physical body, according to Descartes. Physical stuff doesn't move itself. It doesn't do much of anything. It just takes up space. That's all it does. It doesn't think. It doesn't have minds. It doesn't have desires to go back to its natural place. None of that craziness. Right? Also, it's divisible. We have smaller parts. Okay? The reason that light can pass through objects, can pass through other bodies, according to Descartes, is because the parts are very small. And so they can sort of cut through all of the other physical bodies and pass through it. That's why if you hold a piece of cloth up to the light shines through. It's because the particles are cutting their way through. Air consists of smaller parts, right? So we have all these sort of composite things, but they're all essentially the same. Everything that takes up space is material, according to Descartes. There's no such thing as a vacuum. There's no such thing as empty space. That's impossible. How can you imagine an extended space that's not extended? That's impossible. It's crazy, right? It doesn't make any sense. So for Descartes, the space in between the air is filled up by smaller particles, right? He has what's called the plenum view. There is no such thing as empty space. And he has some comical arguments, right, that sound totally insane. One of them goes something like this. So for example, it seems like there's nothing in between myself and Coglia right now. But if there was nothing between us, we would be touching, and we're not touching, so there has to be something between us. Not in a romantic sense, of course, but physically. This is one of his arguments. And it sounds crazy to us now, but that's part of the view. He borrows from Aristotle the claim that nature abhors a vacuum, of course. And also part of the Cartesian story is that everything should be explained mechanically. The universe, according to Descartes, is just a big machine, and we can explain it all in terms of mechanical behaviors. There's no such thing as action at a distance. There's no gravity or anything like that. The way that he describes how magnets work is kind of interesting. He thought that magnets actually send out little screws, and that's what pulls the things together, right? But it's purely mechanical. That's part of his story. He even says, in a couple times, a couple different places, the relevant phenomena include all of the things that we see here on Earth. Because everything that takes up space is exactly the same, the laws that govern physical stuff on Earth are going to be the laws that govern physical stuff out in space. Because space is just more of the same stuff. In fact, this insane drawing that you have over here is Descartes' own version of the universe. He thinks that everything sort of works in a vortical motion. So at the center you have the smallest particles, light, and they spin because of the motion that was put into them by God, he says. All motion of physical bodies is derivable from God. And they spin, and so what ends up happening is just, if you watch, smaller particles move to the middle, the bigger ones move out to the sides, and all of a sudden you have light in the middle and planets on the outside. And it just follows from the nature of physical stuff, he says. It's just entailed by the fact that physical stuff works the way it does. It's divisible. And when you start spinning physical stuff, that's what happens. It's kind of crazy. And so he says, explicitly in the Meditations and elsewhere, that we can make sense of all of physics simply on the basis of geometry. The only principles which I accept or require in physics are those of geometry and pure mathematics. These principles explain all natural phenomena and enable us to provide quite certain demonstrations, he says. I don't know if any of you are starting to put the pieces together here, but we'll get back to it in a second. So for Descartes, the terrestrial and celestial bodies must behave in exactly the same way because they're the same thing. There's no difference whatsoever between them. Everything is literally identical in nature. So let's go back and re-look at what might have worried Descartes a little bit about this claim. Re-examine this. I want to suggest that what would actually warrant the kind of concern that Descartes expressed, what would warrant some sort of Galilean problem here, has to do not with some one passage about the sun stopping in the sky, but rather has to do with the ascension of Christ, a central tenet of Christianity. Now, according to the Aristotelian story, you can't have form without matter, and you can't have matter without form. So the ascension has to be Jesus' body going up into heaven. Up, literally. Okay? Now, if you're thinking about the universe in that way, and you think, okay, well look, the laws obviously in outer space are different from what they are here, so it's no problem, right? Cool, no big deal. But if you start thinking that all the laws are the same everywhere, and then you add to that the fact that not only is the Earth moving super fast around stuff, but it's also engaging in its diurnal rotation, spinning on its axis, and that, as Descartes said, we can just examine what happens to things as they happen on Earth. What's going to happen as the body of Christ starts floating up into space? It's going to get whipped out into the jet stream, right? Jesus gets tossed into a crystalline sphere, splat, done. That seems like a pretty big defect in the story, right?
But didn't they already think that the body was gone too? So isn't that what they already thought?
So it's interesting. It's not really clear. It kind of depends on there's a bunch of different interpretive issues, right? And so what I'm suggesting is not necessarily that this is what the cardinals themselves thought, but Descartes might have thought. I don't want to get involved in this kind of stuff, Descartes might be thinking, right? I don't want to possibly be on the hook for anything like that. That's really bad. And of course we can demonstrate that. Just get yourself a basketball and try and balance a pebble on top, right? It's just spin it. It's going to get tossed. So that's bad. Now, of course, what I'm going to suggest, actually, is that the soul ascending, whatever that means, is going to be Descartes' solution, right, at the end of the day. But he feels that he needs to justify it somehow. So let's go back to that structure of the first meditation. I mentioned right off the bat that the meditator starts out by pointing out that she believed all kinds of false things at the very beginning, right? From childhood, all kinds of false beliefs, kind of packed in there. And now, finally, that she's at a sort of mature age with a stretch of time to reflect on these beliefs, is going to undertake the Herculean task of getting rid of all the crappy ones and starting over. Now, there is no question that Descartes was looking to unseat Aristotle. Right? He thought that Aristotle had things totally wrong and wanted to get rid of the theory of forms. He wanted to get rid of all of this complicated stuff. He wanted uniform laws of motion. He wanted all kinds of changes. There's no doubt about that. And so what I'm suggesting is going on here is that the target of the first meditation is specifically Aristotelian physics, and that he's looking to justify his account. Now, here's how he's going to do it. Introducing the method of doubt, of course, pretty standard. That's going to play a big role in getting rid of a lot of beliefs, right? Problems with naive empiricism. Fine, whatever, it's just sort of the first step, right? Kind of greasing the wheels for this attack on Aristotelian empiricism. Aristotle thought that we only get knowledge of the world through the senses. So he's setting us up early in this first meditation to figure out that empiricism isn't going to work. Right? Then we jump forward to the dream argument. And the dream argument itself does a lot of work. Now here's the cool part. At least I think it's the cool part. With the dream argument, what's important isn't really so much what gets thrown away as what survives. All right? And what survives are logic, arithmetic, geometry, and conceptual truths. An important conceptual truth in the Cartesian system is that physical substance is extended and essentially the same. That's a conceptual truth. If you just pay close enough attention to your understanding of physical stuff, you'll understand that, Descartes seems to suggest in Book 6. He said at the end of the Principles, which was published 4 years after the Meditations, that all he needs to get his physics up and running is arithmetic and geometry and pure mathematics. Those things survive the second most powerful skeptical scenario in the dialogue. Those things that he needs. What else does he need? He needs there to be physical stuff. But the painter analogy seems to be doing exactly that. He says, look, out there is stuff. It's out there. It's got to be the cause of these experiences. Right? Now, even better, he leaves open, even though he thinks it's false, concept empiricism. This idea that all of our ideas originally came from the senses. And he leaves it open because what he's trying to show here, and what he has the meditator explicitly say, is that according to the previous systems, all of the accounts of physics, of medicine, of astronomy, any other kind of field, are all up in the air now, right? Because when you're dreaming, physical bodies behave very differently than they do when you're awake. You can have a dream where you flap your arms hard enough and you start flying around the room. But that's probably not going to happen. Now, of course, if Aristotelian physics is right, then according to Aristotelian physics, the kind of form that a thing has determines how it behaves. If Cartesian physics is right, the fact that it's physical stuff determines how it behaves, and it all behaves the same way. It doesn't matter what kind of form it possesses. It doesn't matter how much matter it has. It's all going to behave in exactly the same way. So what he's done, it seems, is given Aristotle one of his fundamental principles that he needs to get his system up and running, and shown that it's still unstable just by itself, right? Just in virtue of the fact that the senses are kind of sometimes deceiving, we can undermine all of the Aristotelian physics. But we can't undermine Cartesian physics at this point. Because we've got the conceptual truths, we've got geometry, we've got arithmetic. We're good, we're up and running. So how does this defend the piety of it? Okay, well if Cartesian physics follows from these three things, how exactly did we figure out a way to doubt those? The only way it's possible to doubt the conceptual truths, to doubt arithmetic, geometry, logic, is to start questioning whether or not God is deceiving us. The only possible way to doubt Cartesian physics is to assume that God is a radical deceiver. So really, it seems, Descartes is trying to tell us, my system isn't impious. Anyone who tries to deny it is impious. You, in order to deny it, have to deny one of these three things: arithmetic, geometry, or the conceptual truths. But if you're going to do that, you need to establish, it seems somehow, that you have some sort of faulty cognitive faculty, that your brain just doesn't work right, that your mind can't possibly wrap itself around anything that's true. But that can't possibly be right, because we all know, of course, that God is perfectly good and isn't going to do that kind of stuff to us. So the only pious cosmology is Descartes', he suggests. I'm not endorsing that, I'm just saying that's his view. But, wait a minute. On any account at all, ever, isn't the ascension story a miracle? Why would Descartes be so concerned about any of this, since that seems to be one of the central points of my argument here? Why would he think that God couldn't just whip up another miracle, right? Just suspend the laws of motion or something and let Jesus pass through and then we're good. Why not? Well, Descartes defers back to the church himself in the fourth replies and says, in a lengthy discussion of transubstantiation, which itself is, of course, supposed to be a miracle, says, theologians prefer not to attribute miracles to what can be explained by natural reason. Now, of course, here's something that Descartes thinks is explained by the light of nature, right? Natural reason. Dualism. That the mind is a separate substance from the body. That the soul is not a physical thing that's extended throughout the body, as Aristotle seemed to imply. It's not some form that has to coexist with matter. It's a separable thing that can come apart and exist independent of the physical stuff. The physical stuff doesn't think. The mind stuff doesn't take up space. They can come apart. They're separable. Now, we have at our disposal the tools to make sense of the ascension in virtue of the soul floating up, whatever. It doesn't take up space. It doesn't move. It doesn't go in directions. And we can deal with that just fine and not have to worry about all of these other things. We don't have to appeal to anything supernatural. We don't have to appeal to miracles when they're not necessary. And so Descartes thinks that he's solved all of these problems. Now, of course, there are all sorts of reasons to reject Cartesian physics and stuff. I mean, one of which being that there are vacuums. We saw that later. But I think that's what's going on in the Meditations. I think he's trying to build in, early on, a defense of his own view. Now, you're not going to get that on the first reading, and Descartes doesn't think you're going to get that on the first reading. He thinks once you get through the Meditations and you start to get a grip, a little bit, on the nature of physics. And then you go back and you read some of his other stuff. You read the Principles, which he published later. You read some of his work on vision. You read some of his work on optics. You're going to start kind of getting the feel for what's going on, then you're going to go back and see it. It all follows necessarily from God's nature. There are no problems with the earth being in motion. Everything is okay. Thank you.
All right. So what I often find is an easy way to do this is if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll call it a number, and then we will go through the numbers as we see them. So hands for questions. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. We'll start with Tony. See what we get.
So, Chris, all this is very interesting. Thanks for a fun talk. I guess I want to know why you think the ascension is the doctrine to pick on.
Mm-hmm.
Because it looks to me like there are going to be other central Christian doctrines that are going to create problems for Cartesian physics as you've set it up. And I'm thinking here of the resurrection, not the resurrection of Jesus, but the resurrection of all souls at the end of the time of the last judgment. Pretty central Christian doctrine is that the resurrection is going to be a bodily resurrection, the resurrection of the body, and so you're not going to be allowed to use Cartesian dualism and say the resurrection is just of the soul in order to escape the problem the way that you might in the case of the ascension. Whether Jesus' body ascends or not, we might be able to debate that, but it's a pretty long-standing Christian doctrine that the final resurrection is the resurrection of the body. So again, so I have this general question, why did you pick the ascension as the doctrine to pick on? Because I mean, nowhere does Descartes say anything about that being the issue.
Right. I mean, I picked it because I thought it fit neatly in with his concerns about Galileo specifically. I hadn't actually considered the final resurrection really at all. And I don't know that I see that as a serious problem for Cartesian physics. Because if all matter is essentially the same, it's just reorganized in different ways, then the final the final resurrection, if it is a bodily resurrection, is going to end up just being a reorganization. If that's going to have to be a miracle, right? But it's going to be a reorganization of the physical stuff, and then you can just throw all the souls back in them.
Well, it depends on how and when you think the resurrection happens. If you
Okay.
think that there's a resurrection that happens before the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and then it really is people rising up bodily, just like JC. Then you can have props.
Interesting. Okay. No, that's a helpful suggestion. Thank you. Actually, I hadn't considered that. I'll have to give that some more thought. What was the second part of your question?
I guess I wanted to know why you picked up the Ascension in particular, but you addressed that. You just think that this is the doctrine that fits the words.
Yeah, basically.
Well, I would say that it makes more sense to pick the Ascension because when people rise up, they're not at risk. They're still staying on the earth. They're not at risk of flying off into the cosmos somewhere. So, I mean, the Ascension is really the only part in the Bible where somebody's in danger of.
I'm worried that on Cartesian physics, when Jesus comes tomorrow afternoon and I start rising up, with all the saints, and I'm going to get whipped off the earth.
Wait, we rise?
Yeah, bodies and everything. It's going to be great.
I thought we just hung out. I've been hanging out with too many people.
Well, I mean, there's different ways to hash out the view. There's different ways to hash out the view of precisely when and how the resurrection happens. But on one view, the bodily resurrection happens, and it's not like the world continues to exist.
I think you were next.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, that's only one view on how the Bible has been interpreted. I mean, there's many Christians that have also interpreted that, define what the body is in a biblical standpoint. There's a lot of different ways that you can interpret it. I know a lot of people believe that it is going to be just the soul, and I've read interpretations of it just being the soul. So then it would still fit. I mean, it's an interesting point to raise, but there's few interpretations of it.
It's tough because we are working with a particular time period, right? And so this is why I'm trying to couch a lot of it in terms of what might have actually rooted Descartes, and not necessarily the particles. Because there's been a lot of work done, I think, important and interesting work done about what actually got Galileo in trouble, suggesting that it was probably more political than it was doctrinal. Whether or not I don't know. I'm not an expert in Galileo, but so there's sort of that going on in the background too. So I want to try and at least keep it somewhat historically accurate.
Is referring to yourself as a Cartesian theist contradictory? The reason I ask is because to consider yourself Cartesian, you have to take Descartes' entire argument because all the parts create the whole. And the theist is plagued with this notion that to accept their principles, they have to shave off some of Descartes' principles.
Mm-hmm.
So is referring to yourself as a Cartesian theist contradictory?
I'm inclined to think no. I think that Descartes was a theist of some kind. And I think that it's tricky also because there were a lot of people who got really excited about Descartes right after Descartes had published all of this stuff, who were considered Cartesians but had sort of very, very different and disparate interpretations of what Descartes was doing and what a Cartesian should be committed to. So I guess my sort of gut reaction is no, but I also kind of want to know a little bit more about what you mean by Cartesian.
Well, the method of doubt, fool me once, that's it.
Right.
Well, I'd have to say that God's fooled us multiple times.
Sure.
So I hold that to accept this Cartesian principle, kind of a stark opposite direction of traditional theism.
Awesome. Okay, good. So a couple of different things. So first, I want to suggest that and this is maybe something that I didn't make totally clear in the talk, but the method of doubt, Descartes' meditator says in the first meditation right at the beginning, once in the course of your life should you go through this process. This isn't like a general principle that we need to have at all times. This is a tool that's being used to sort of expedite the process of getting rid of the crappy beliefs and then starting over. And once we've done that, when we're careful, we'll never go wrong again, because we'll only assent to those things that are clear and distinct, which guarantees that they're true and necessarily follow and everything like that. So that's one thing, right? So that principle by itself, sure, leads us, I mean, as you can see from the first meditation, it leads us to a bunch of sort of anti-theist positions. But of course, famously also, and perhaps frustratingly for anybody who's in my modern class, looking around, Descartes thinks that he can get out of it in the third meditation, and then again in the fifth, he offers, I think in total, 3 arguments for God's existence. And I have an even crazier story about how exactly that's supposed to work, but we don't need to get into that right now. But so ultimately, it also depends on what you mean by sort of a traditional theist, because I don't think Descartes was one of those.
Well, the traditional theist is not going to accept this notion that Jesus ascended up and then the jet stream came by and went,
well, I know, and that's what I'm saying is maybe it has worried him. And so he's trying to provide a way of getting people into the appropriate mindset, the appropriate sort of understanding of how physics works. But then also in the meditations, because he says he has basically 2 aims. One is to establish the real distinction between mind and body, and 2 is to establish the foundation for all of sort of, well, systematic knowledge, which is ultimately the divine guarantee that you get in the third and fifth meditations.
did we assume that Jesus Christ was 100% divine and 100% human as he ascended? And indeed, at the pinnacle of his ascension.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of interesting places where Descartes talks about miracles and talks about different things that we can't actually make sense of, right? Like, so 100% divine, 100% human. He doesn't list that one specifically, but he, as I mentioned, spends a lot of time worrying about the Eucharist. And he's like, that I don't understand how that's supposed to work, but I'm not supposed to understand it, and I recognize that, and it's fine. The same worry shows up with free will, and he says, look, yeah, so, I mean, it's obvious to me that I'm totally free, but it's also obvious that nothing could possibly ever exist without God having made it exactly that way. And I'll stay out of trouble if I don't try and make sense of it. Right? So he has these sort of like frustratingly annoying inconsistencies that are kind of like, they show up periodically. And then I have, of course, complicated stories about how they're not totally awful. But again, that would take us way too far afield. So can we assume that? Sure.
Sure.
Just don't think too hard about it, basically.
So it's at least plausible.
Sure.
That an individual could be a Cartesian theist.
Oh, definitely.
I have a question a little bit more, not so much off topic, just a little bit more away from Descartes, about Aristotle's forms, the accidental and the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of noticed like the similarities between John Locke's the primary and secondary qualities. Do you have anything to say on that?
Well, so it's interesting because so Locke's primary-secondary quality distinction, Locke stole from Descartes, and Descartes stole it from Galileo. Whether or not, so I'm not quite as well versed in Aristotelian forms as I am, say, in Descartes, but I know a little bit, and I suspect that there are some accidental forms that are things like colors, right? And those can come and go. We could paint the chair a different color, and it's now taken on a different form or something like that. So I guess I'm wondering, in what sense did you see the sort of clear parallel?
Oh, I guess just like how you said, I don't know what the other form was. The first one, how it's essential, how it makes it what it is, and goes on changing. I thought that was kind of like primary qualities.
Right, like the primary qualities that are sort of inseparable from the body or something like that, right? Where the secondary qualities are accidental or something in that sense. Well, so one thing that would distinguish the two is that the accidental properties for Aristotle don't just exist in minds, right? They're actually like in the bodies as well. So Locke thinks, of course, that the secondary qualities are nothing in the body themselves, but the power to produce in a mind some sort of sensation, right? And so Aristotle's going to say, no, they're actually out there. They're in the things, right? So that's going to be the only difference. I mean, they're of course changeable, but yeah. Where are we?
Well, did it never occur when he was throwing out false beliefs and keeping the good ones that there may not be a God at all?
Well, in the first meditation at the end, he seems to suggest it's at least possible that there's no God. But then by the third, he's seen by the light of nature, whatever that's supposed to mean, that God exists, and necessarily, it's.
I think he's just too scared to.
No, I think he actually did believe it. I think he did believe that there was a God, but not the kind of personal being who's going to hang out with you and be worried and who you can bargain with. He says in the preface explicitly that atheists get themselves in trouble because they start attributing human emotion and human content to a being that it just doesn't apply to. They're confused. God is this, I suggest, sort of a Neoplatonic like unity of goodness. It's just this infinite being that is entirely unified. I think there's good textual reason for that as well, but I don't think he's just afraid. And I think that I have, again, a totally crazy story about why he thinks God exists. I think that he was influenced by the Spanish mystics. He was encouraged and consistently went back to the French school of spirituality, who were themselves mystics, for approval before he published anything. And so I think that he's under the impression that you have to have some sort of like direct apprehension of God. It's a mystical union. And in 1619, before any of this, he describes himself as having had a mystical experience. So.
There.
I had missed something, but is Galileo kind of taking an Aristotelian view? Is that why when Descartes tries to like break down Aristotle's physics, that sort of also kind of going against the Heliocentrism of Galileo?
No, not really. So Galileo was not terribly Aristotelian at all. He was much more of a mechanicist as well. It's just that Descartes thought that he didn't have some things right in terms of the details.
So that whole argument against Aristotle is kind of separate from that.
Right.
I have two questions. One, have you read Stephen Toulmin's book on Descartes? It seems to me that in that book, he tried to situate him historically by saying, here's a 30 years war, these terrible fights between just different Christian sects.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem that he's concerned about. So he's trying to show philosophically a set of beliefs which are important for whatever kind of Christian you are.
Okay.
You know? And he thinks he succeeds at that. Okay. So I'm wondering, one, what you think of that historical way of looking at Descartes, rather than this fight about Aristotle that you think he's fighting. And then second, maybe bringing back to Tony's point, you're worried about the resurrection. If I hear you right, you said the resurrection is solved by, instead of having Jesus' body flying off, it's just his soul goes up. Right?
Metaphorically, right? I mean, it's got to be, because souls aren't extended. They don't move.
Right.
Yeah.
But the important point is that you seem to be working at is you eliminate the need for the body
Right.
to violate the laws of physics.
Right.
And but it seems you worry about the resurrection. You worry about Jesus' resurrection, which is an important Christian belief, I think. And so I'm wondering how that's solving anything. And then second, going back to the transubstantiation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, within an Aristotelian framework, you have a solution for that, right? Mm-hmm. You have a substantial form of a human being with accidental qualities of bread.
Right.
And if you take your way of doing this, you don't have it as a possibility anymore.
Right.
So transubstantiation, pretty fundamental belief which people are fighting over, is not compatible with Cartesian physics.
Right.
So if you want to get out of that with a miracle, then why not resurrect Jesus' body with a miracle the same way?
Sure. Yeah, so Descartes does spend, I'll address the last part first and then go back, does spend a ton of time avoiding theological controversies. He is super afraid of trying to wade into those kinds of things. Whenever people try to bait him into talking about what he thinks is theology and not properly philosophy, which also includes physics at this point, he avoids it. And he says, look, that's a matter for the priests to work out. I'm not going to dig into that. But he finally does, in the fourth reply, spend about 6 or 8 pages trying to explain how exactly it is that his view is compatible with the transubstantiation problem. And I'm not certain that I understand what his solution is. I'm not going to try and pretend that I do. But he says he has one, and he consistently asserts over and over and over again that nothing that he said is inconsistent with that. Now, of course, he might be wrong, or he might not have had an answer, but he just keeps saying it, right? I mean, I'm inclined to think that it's really, really hard to go back to your first question. So that's not a great answer for you, but it's an attempt. Well, right. I'm going to blame it on him. To go back to your first question, though, of course there are all of these, that's an interesting sort of worry. There are all of these different issues, the 30 Years' War, there are all these different social problems. And of course I think that it's very difficult and perhaps wrong to try and pull somebody out of the particular intellectual context and the social context and things like that. That's a beef I have with another famous historian of philosophy, who I won't name. But so I think that's an important feature of what's going on. But I don't think that it's right to say that Descartes was only concerned with like making everybody happy about being Christians or something like that. I mean, it's pretty clear, and he has stated explicitly in letters that he's going after Aristotle, that he doesn't like Aristotle, that he thinks that the forms are crazy, that they're wrong, and that they just don't constitute anything in the world. And that it has led to a bunch of false beliefs in physics, and that he wants to make sure we're doing physics right. Which is why the last 3 books of the Principles are all physics. So I think that maybe he was trying to like build in also something about like, well look, these are sort of central tenets of Christianity that you guys should all probably buy into. And so that may be an extra facet of what's going on in the Meditations. But I don't think that we can deny that like all over the Meditations, he has Aristotle as a target. Right after he recognizes the existence of the self, he says, but what is this self? Is it a rational animal, as so many philosophers like to say? Well, no, it can't be that. That's too complicated. That's weird. And then he says, well, okay, so maybe it's this soul thing. Well, is the soul something that's spread out throughout the body, that is like in the sense organs, that takes in the information? No, it isn't. But these are Aristotelian views. He's targeting them explicitly, like all over the place. So I think that you can't sort of tease that away, entirely at least, from what's going on in the Meditations.
Don't you think that in the attempt to kill the demon, that distinction he uses between the formal and objective reality of ideas, that's really very Aristotelian, it seems to me.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, he definitely doesn't get rid of everything that Aristotle said. But I think that Descartes is much more influenced by Plato. And I think that Aristotle was clearly influenced by Plato. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of overlap between the 3 of them. And so I think it's much more actually a Platonic account.
What's the possibility that some of the comments on I'm a Christian and this doesn't violate Christianity is merely a rhetorical strategy and not intended to be consistent with his attempt to define physics?
Right.
I mean, we can't query him directly.
Sure.
And I've not read any of his letters to Mersenne, because maybe some of that is revealed. But it would seem to me that given his overt concern about what happened to Galileo, that maybe some of that is simply put in there so that he can get the damn book published.
Sure. That's another I think, rightly common objection, right? I mean, there are all kinds of places where I mean, I start off the paper by pointing out how much he gives deference to the church because he's afraid of getting in trouble with them. But I think it would be historically peculiar to claim that, in general, somebody like Descartes was perhaps an atheist just faking all of it so that he could just get away with doing physics. Now, there are people who have argued that.
A much more plausible approach would be that he didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
Didn't want to get into religious disputes. And at any rate, there isn't an answer to that. But
Right.
I do think that one of the things that might be considered is that not every part of the Meditations or any of the other works of Descartes, that not every part of it has to be consistent.
Good. Actually, so I think that's exactly right about the Meditations. I think that a large part of the Meditations isn't supposed to be consistent. The first two Meditations, I think there are very few things that are properly Cartesian actually in them.
I have a follow-up question, which is a little more historical.
Okay.
If my memory serves, folks like Thomas Aquinas and a number of the people back in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, 15th century, were at great pains to attempt to reconcile Aristotelian doctrine with church doctrine, which up to that point in time had been pretty well dominated by Platonic theory. I find it interesting that nearly 100 or so years later, that Descartes is at such pains to attack Aristotle when, certainly by his time, none of the church fathers that were even thinking about things like this were at all concerned with Aristotle. He had been brought back into the church family, and all's well. Let's go on to dealing with the demons and that sort of stuff. So don't you find it interesting that he would be at such pains to attack someone that so recently had been declared to be consistent with Catholic doctrine?
I mean, this is where I want to kind of lean back on the physics again and say that he's really more concerned with Aristotelian physics, and he thinks that the metaphysics is just leading us down a bad road, that the substantial forms and all of this stuff are just bad news. But there's also, at the time that Descartes is doing all of this, there's been a resurgence of this sort of Neoplatonism or this Neo-Pythagoreanism. And so he's trying to reconcile simultaneously this mechanistic worldview with this kind of new excitement about geometry and this sort of thing. And of course, Descartes himself was a crazy mathematician. Not that mathematicians are all crazy, if they're math profs too. But, so I think that, I mean, in a lot of ways, he's trying to go back to the Platonic influence. He consistently compares himself to Augustine. And as I suggested, like, he was really influenced by the Spanish Neoplatonists. And so I think that I mean, why exactly does he decide to go after Aristotle after Aristotle's been deemed okay? I don't know, but he does.
From an historian's point of view, thank you for bringing in historical context to help understand philosophical development. I'm wondering that your last question, Chris, I don't know if it's the cause, but what would be the effect of bringing in Neoplatonic thought when Aristotelian philosophy had been so integrated into scholastic theology? What better way to undermine the current bureaucracy in the church than to reintroduce Augustine and Neoplatonism?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly right. What would the effect be?
I guess it's kind of a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
In some ways, it seems to me that would be an effect.
Sure.
If you undercut the current theological stance of the hierarchy, what better way to do it than to undermine Aristotelian physics?
Right. Yeah.
Token historian.
No, that's great. No, so that's certainly an interesting aspect of this, and there's no doubt that, I mean, Descartes wasn't exactly kind to all of his interlocutors either. But at the same time, you have these. So he's definitely excited about the mechanical philosophy. He's definitely aware of Hobbes and Gassendi and these sorts of guys. In fact, he and Gassendi have the longest exchange in the objections and replies. So ultimately, what I think actually is going on in the Meditations is that he's writing for everybody, right? He's the reason that he is doing this whole like, oh, we all need to get rid of all of our beliefs thing, is because he's not just writing for Aristotelians. He's also writing for mechanists, for Hobbesians, for all of these other folks, and saying, you guys are all on unstable ground. You're just as unstable as Aristotle is. Anybody who's an empiricist is unstable. Anybody who doesn't sort of just recognize the inconceivable power of God is not okay. But of course, he thinks that he can build it back up starting from God. That's the first step, right? So we start from that, but what could be more pious than that? So if he undercuts the church, and then they try to challenge him, they have to challenge him from the foundation, but the foundation is God, so how are you going to go after that? So maybe that's what gives him this attitude that he has toward everyone who tries to challenge him, is that he thinks he's divinely inspired. Maybe.
Well, let's thank Chris. Sweet.
Chris, it's 1 Corinthians 15,
Okay.
35 to 45.
Uh-huh.
And then we do get, so it's interesting, so there's talk of, if you want to know, there's talk about body